The autumn wind howled through the skeletal branches outside Marcus Blackwood's study, rattling the Victorian windows of his Boston townhouse. The distinguished detective sat behind his mahogany desk, amber eyes scanning the morning newspaper when the telephone's shrill ring pierced the October silence. Few people possessed his private number, and fewer still would dare disturb his morning ritual of coffee and contemplation. Blackwood, speaking, his refined voice carried the authority of a man who had solved the unsolvable. "Detective, thank God you're there." Inspector Carter's voice crackled through the connection, tension evident even through the static. "I need your expertise immediately. We have a situation in Ravenshollow Manor, about 3 hours north of Boston." Blackwood set down his coffee cup, the fine china clicking against the saucer. "What manner of situation, Inspector?" "A death. Suspicious circumstances. The victim is Victoria Ashworth, a prominent art collector. Found dead in her locked study this morning." Carter's breathing was heavy, as if he'd been running. But here's the peculiar part. The room was sealed from the inside, no other way out, and yet something doesn't add up. The detective's fingers drummed against the leather-bound case files on his desk. An impossible murder in a locked room, the very puzzle that set his brilliant mind ablaze. "Tell me more about the scene." "The manor is hosting an exclusive art auction weekend. 20 guests, all prominent collectors and dealers. Victoria was found by her personal secretary at 7 a.m. when she failed to appear for breakfast. The study door was locked from the inside, key still in the lock. Windows are barred and secured. No other entrance." Blackwood rose from his chair, already mentally packing. "'Cause of death?" "Appears to be poison, but we won't know for certain until the coroner arrives. There's a teacup beside her, half empty." "But Detective ... Carter's voice dropped to an almost whisper. "There's something else. The room, it's like a museum was ransacked. Paintings askew, papers scattered, but nothing appears to be missing." "I'll be there within the hour," Blackwood declared, already reaching for his coat. "Have you secured the scene?" "Absolutely. Nobody in or out of that study. The guests are confined to the manor. There's a storm coming. Roads will be impassable soon." Perfect, Blackwood thought. A classic locked room mystery with a house full of suspects trapped by nature itself. As he hung up the phone, he noticed his assistant, Eleanor Hayes, ascending the stairs, her auburn hair catching the morning light filtering through the stained glass. "Eleanor, cancel my afternoon appointments. We have a case." Her green eyes lit up with a familiar spark of excitement that made her an invaluable partner. "Another impossible murder? The most impossible kind. A locked room, a dead art collector, and 20 suspects trapped in a manor." Blackwood shrugged into his wool overcoat, checking that his magnifying glass and notebook were secure in the inner pockets. "Pack for several days. If this storm hits as Carter suggests, we'll be investigating from the inside." 90 minutes later, their motor car crunched up the gravel drive of Ravenshollow Manor. The Gothic Revival mansion loomed against the darkening sky, its towers and gargoyles casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. Storm clouds gathered overhead, promising the isolation that would turn their investigation into a race against time. Inspector Carter met them at the grand entrance, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained anxiety. "Detective Blackwood, Miss Hayes, thank you for coming so quickly. Show us the scene first," Blackwood requested, his observational skills already at work. He noted the nervous energy of the staff, the whispered conversations among guests visible through the drawing room doorway, the way everyone seemed to avoid looking directly at the spiral staircase leading to the upper floors. Trio climbed the oak staircase, their footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged corridor. Carter led them to a heavy mahogany door marked with police tape. "This is Victoria Ashworth's private study. As I mentioned, locked from the inside. Blackwood examined the door frame meticulously, running his fingers along the wood, checking the hinges, testing the lock mechanism. Who has keys to this room? Only Victoria herself, according to her secretary, Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton. The housekeeper, Margaret Winters, has a master key, but she swears it never left her possession. We'll interview them both shortly. Blackwood turned to Eleanor. Please document everything we observe. Every detail could prove crucial. Carter unlocked the door, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. The study was a shrine to fine art. Oil paintings and gilded frames lined the walls. Rare sculptures occupied every available surface, and books on art history filled floor-to-ceiling shelves. But something had disturbed this carefully curated space, Victoria. Ashworth sat slumped in her leather chair behind an antique desk, her silver hair falling across her face like a curtain. A delicate china teacup sat beside her right hand, its contents leaving brown stains on scattered papers. Her reading glasses lay broken on the Persian rug, as if they had fallen when she collapsed. Don't touch anything yet, Blackwood cautioned, beginning his methodical examination. He moved like a dancer around the room, observing, cataloging, building the foundation of understanding that would ultimately reveal the truth. Eleanor sketched the room's layout while taking careful notes. The tea service is still warm. Suggests she died recently before discovery. Note the positioning of the paintings, Blackwood murmured, pointing to several frames that hung at odd angles. This suggests either a struggle or a deliberate search. Yet nothing appears damaged or missing. He knelt beside the victim, careful not to disturb the scene. Victoria Ashworth had been an elegant woman in her 70s, dressed in an expensive navy dress with pearl jewelry. Her fingers showed no signs of defensive wounds. Her position suggested she had simply slumped forward in her chair. The teacup, Eleanor observed, sketching its position. Half-empty lipstick mark on the rim. If poison was the method, then we must determine who had access to prepare or tamper with her morning tea. Blackwood stood, his eyes scanning the room's perimeter. Inspector, you mentioned the windows were barred. Carter gestured toward the tall windows behind the desk. Installed years ago as security for her art collection. Iron bars, no way to remove them from inside or outside without tools and considerable time. Blackwood tested each window latch, examined the bars, and even checked the chimney of the small fireplace. The classical locked room puzzle. Every entrance and exit secured, yet someone managed to commit murder and vanish without a trace. Unless ... Eleanor hesitated, then voiced what they were all thinking. Unless it was suicide made to look like murder? A possibility we cannot dismiss, Blackwood agreed, but the disturbed state of the room suggests otherwise. Suicidal individuals rarely ransack their own possessions before taking their lives. A soft knock interrupted their examination. A woman's voice called through the door. Inspector Carter? I'm Mrs. Pemberton, Victoria's secretary. You wanted to speak with me? Let's begin gathering information, Blackwood decided. Eleanor continued documenting the scene. Inspector, let's interview the secretary and then gather all the guests. In cases like these, the murderer is invariably among those present. As they prepared to leave the study, Blackwood paused at the threshold, his keen eyes making one final sweep of the room. Something nagged at the edge of his consciousness, a detail that didn't quite fit, a piece of the puzzle that seemed deliberately placed rather than naturally occurring. The game was afoot, and Marcus Blackwood felt the familiar thrill of the hunt beginning. Somewhere in this manner, a killer walked among the guests, believing themselves safe behind the impossibility of their crime. But Blackwood had built his reputation on solving the impossible, and this case would be no exception. The storm outside grew stronger, wind rattling the manor's windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Soon, the roads would be impassable, trapping everyone inside until the mystery was solved. in the Gothic atmosphere of Raven's Hollow Manor. With 20 suspects and one brilliant detective, the stage was set for a deadly game of cat and mouse. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton proved to be a nervous woman in her 50s, her hands trembling as she twisted a lace handkerchief. They interviewed her in the manor's library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that seemed to absorb sound and create an intimate atmosphere for confession. Mrs. Ashworth was very particular about her morning routine, Pemberton explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Tea at precisely 6:30 a.m., always in her study while she reviewed the day's auction materials. Who prepared the tea? Blackwood inquired, noting how the woman's eyes darted toward the door as if seeking escape. Usually Margaret Winters, the housekeeper. But this morning, ... double quote, she paused, pressing the handkerchief to her lips. This morning, Mrs. Ashworth specifically requested that I prepare it. She said she had important work and didn't want to be disturbed until 8 a.m. Eleanor looked up from her notes. Did she seem troubled about anything? Any concerns about the auction or the guests? Oh, yes, very troubled indeed. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward conspiratorially. There had been some unpleasantness yesterday evening. Accusations about authenticity of certain pieces, heated arguments about provenance. Mrs. Ashworth was quite upset. Blackwood's interest sharpened. What sort of accusations? Well, there's Professor Edmund Hartley. He's an art authentication expert from Harvard. He suggested that one of the paintings might be a forgery. Mrs. Ashworth was furious. Then there's Richard Sterling, the art dealer from New York. He implied that some of the pieces might have questionable ownership history. And how did Mrs. Ashworth respond to these accusations? She announced she would be conducting a thorough review of all documentation. Said she would expose any attempts to discredit her collection. Mrs. Pemberton's voice grew even quieter. She was particularly angry with Dr. Helena Morrison, the museum curator. They had words about a Renaissance sculpture. Eleanor made careful notes of each name. Was there anyone Mrs. Ashworth seemed to trust implicitly? Her nephew, James Ashworth. He manages her business affairs. And perhaps Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne. They've been friends for decades, both prominent art collectors. Tell us about the tea preparation this morning. Blackwood pressed. I brought the service to her study at exactly 6:30. Used. Her finest china, the spode set she reserved for special occasions. Earl Grey with honey, as always. Mrs. Pemberton dabbed at her eyes. She was already working at her desk, papers scattered everywhere. She barely looked up when I entered. Did you notice anything unusual about her behavior or the study? The papers were already disorganized when I arrived. I offered to tidy them, but she waved me away, said she was looking for something important. Oh, and there was a magnifying glass on the desk. She was examining some documents very closely. Blackwood exchanged glances with Eleanor. What sort of documents? I couldn't see clearly, but they looked like certificates or authenticity papers. She seemed quite agitated about whatever she was reading. After dismissing Mrs. Pemberton with instructions to remain available, the trio reconvened in the study. The storm outside had intensified, and the manor's electric lights flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows across the disturbed art collection. So we have a victim who was specifically investigating questions about her collection's authenticity, Blackwood summarized, who requested unusual privacy this morning, and who was found dead after examining important documents. Documents that are now scattered and potentially compromised, Eleanor added, gesturing toward the papers around the victim's chair. Carter nodded grimly. Means, motive, and opportunity all point toward someone with intimate knowledge of the art world and access to this room. But how? Blackwood mused, returning to his examination of the locked door. The physical impossibility remains. Until we solve the how, we cannot determine the who. As if summoned by their discussion, a new voice spoke from the corridor. "Excuse me, officers? I'm James Ashworth, Victoria's nephew. I understand you're investigating my aunt's death." The man who entered was in his 40s, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His resemblance to the deceased was unmistakable, the same aristocratic features, the same intelligent eyes. "Mr. Ashworth?" Blackwood responded, noting how the man's gaze immediately went to his aunt's body before quickly looking away. "Please accept our condolences. We'll need to speak with you shortly about your aunt's business affairs and recent concerns." "Of course. Anything to help find who did this." James Ashworth's voice carried genuine grief, but Blackwood detected something else. Anxiety, perhaps, or guilt. "I should mention that Aunt Victoria called me last night around 11 p.m. She was quite agitated about something she discovered in her collection records. This revelation changed everything." Blackwood felt the familiar electric sensation of a crucial clue falling into place. What exactly did she discover? She wouldn't say over the telephone, only that she'd found evidence of deception going back years. "She asked me to come early this morning to discuss legal options." His voice cracked slightly. "I was supposed to meet with her at 8 a.m. Eleanor looked up from her notes, green eyes bright with realization. So someone knew that Mrs. Ashworth had discovered something damaging, and that she planned to take action this morning, which gives us our motive, Carter concluded. "But we still don't have our method or our killer." As the morning wore on, Blackwood methodically interviewed each guest, building a complex picture of relationships, rivalries, and potential motives. The storm outside had transformed Ravenshollow Manor into an island of isolation, with phones down and roads impassable. The killer was trapped inside with them, a situation that would either force a confession or escalate to further violence. Web of suspects grew more intricate with each interview. Professor Hartley, the authentication expert, had been publicly humiliated by Victoria's defense of a painting he'd questioned. Dr. Morrison, the museum curator, had been engaged in a bitter dispute over the provenance of a Renaissance sculpture. Richard Sterling, the art dealer, stood to lose millions if certain pieces in the auction were proven fraudulent. But it was the final interview of the morning that provided the most shocking revelation. Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne, Victoria's supposed friend and fellow collector, revealed that she and Victoria had been engaged in a secret rivalry for decades. Victoria was ruthless, Mrs. Blackthorne declared, her aristocratic composure cracking slightly. She would do anything to acquire a piece she wanted, forge documents, bribe sellers, even steal if necessary. I had proof of her illegal activities. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the central mystery remained. In a locked room with no possible means of entry or exit, how had the killer committed the perfect crime? As Blackwood stood once again in Victoria Ashworth's study, watching the storm rage outside the barred windows, he felt the familiar stirring of insight. The answer was here, hidden in plain sight among the scattered papers and disturbed artwork. He just had to see it with the right perspective. Asterisk, the grandfather clock in Ravenshollow. Manor's main hall chimed noon as Marcus Blackwood gathered the suspects in the grand drawing room. The storm had reached its full fury, transforming the world beyond the tall windows into a swirling chaos of snow and ice. Lightning illuminated the Gothic architecture in stark, dramatic flashes, while thunder rolled across the landscape like cannon fire. They were truly isolated now, no escape for the guilty. Number rescue for the innocent. 20 guests sat in an uncomfortable semicircle of velvet chairs and antique settees, their faces reflecting varying degrees of anxiety, grief, and barely concealed fear. The killer was among them, Blackwood was certain of it. The question was not who had motive, for several did, but who possessed both the means and opportunity to commit murder in an impossible locked, Eleanor had positioned herself near the fireplace, her notebook ready to capture every nuance of expression, every telling gesture that might reveal guilt. Inspector Carter stood by the door, his hand resting casually near his service weapon, prepared for any sudden confessions or desperate attempts at escape. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood began, his cultured voice carrying easily across the room, "I'm sure you're all aware that Mrs. Victoria Ashworth met with a suspicious death sometime between 6:30 and 7 o'clock this morning. What you may not know is that she was murdered." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled group. "Mrs. Cordelia." Blackthorne pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, while Professor Hartley adjusted his spectacles nervously. Dr. Helena Morrison sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. "The preliminary examination suggests poison," Blackwood continued, watching their faces intently. "Administered through her morning tea. However, the circumstances of her death present us with what appears to be an impossible crime, a locked room mystery of the most classic variety." James Ashworth leaned forward in his chair. "Surely you don't suspect one of us? There must be some explanation. A servant with access, perhaps?" "I'm afraid not, Mr. Ashworth. The physical evidence is quite clear. Mrs. Ashworth's study was locked from the inside, with no other means of entry or exit. The windows are barred, the chimney too narrow for human passage, and the walls are solid stone. Yet someone managed to poison her tea and disappear without a trace." Dr. Morrison spoke up, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "This is preposterous. Victoria was a difficult woman, certainly, but none of us are murderers. Perhaps it was suicide, guilt over some of the questionable pieces in her collection finally catching up with her. An intriguing theory, Doctor, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The disturbed state of the study, the scattered authentication documents, and most telling of all, the telephone call Mrs. Ashworth made to her nephew last evening, all point to murder." Richard Sterling, the art dealer from New York, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His expensive suit was wrinkled and perspiration beaded on his forehead, despite the room's chill. "What telephone call? What did she say?" Blackwood allowed a slight smile to play across his lips. "She told Mr. Ashworth that she had discovered evidence of deception going back years within her collection records. She planned to take legal action this morning." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm's fury outside. Several guests exchanged meaningful glances, while others stared fixedly at their hands or out the windows. "Now," Blackwood continued, "let's examine what we know about each of your whereabouts this morning, and more importantly, your access to Mrs. Ashworth's tea." He began pacing the room like a professor delivering a lecture, his keen eyes missing nothing. "Mrs. Pemberton prepared the tea at Mrs. Ashworth's specific request, unusual, as the housekeeper normally performed this task. The tea service was brought to the study at precisely 6:30 a.m. Margaret Winters, the housekeeper, spoke up from her position near the servants' entrance. "That's right, sir. Mrs. Ashworth sent word through Mrs. Pemberton that I wasn't to disturb her until after 8 a.m. Very specific about it, she was. And yet," Blackwood mused, "someone did disturb her. Someone with intimate knowledge of her routines, her habits, and her vulnerabilities." Eleanor looked up from her notes. "Detective, what about the authentication documents? Were you able to determine what Mrs. Ashworth discovered?" "An excellent question, Miss Hayes." Blackwood moved to stand beside a portrait of the manor's original owner, the candlelight casting dramatic shadows across his face. "Among the scattered papers, we found correspondence dating back 15 years. It appears that Mrs. Ashworth had been systematically acquiring pieces with forged provenance. Papers." Professor Hartley stood abruptly, his face flushed with indignation. "I knew it. I've been questioning the authenticity of several pieces in this collection for months. Victoria refused to submit them for proper analysis. Yes, Professor, your expertise in art authentication is well known. In fact, you've made quite a career of exposing forgeries, haven't you? It's my professional obligation, Hartley replied stiffly. Art fraud is a serious crime that undermines the entire market. Indeed it is. And the financial implications can be staggering. A single exposed forgery can destroy a collector's reputation and cost millions in devalued pieces. Dr. Morrison had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. Are you suggesting that Victoria's entire collection was fraudulent? Not entirely, but significantly compromised. The documents suggest a network of forgers, corrupt dealers, and complicit collectors. Mrs. Ashworth appears to have been both victim and participant, acquiring known forgeries while turning a blind eye to their true nature. Richard. Sterling laughed bitterly. That sounds like Victoria. She cared more about owning beautiful things than owning authentic ones. But surely that's not a motive for murder. On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, in your business, reputation is everything. A dealer associated with systematic fraud would face ruin, criminal charges, and social disgrace. The motive for murder couldn't be stronger. The art dealer's face went ashen. You can't possibly think that at this point, Mr. Sterling. Everyone is a suspect. Blackwood's voice carried a note of steel. Let's examine the timeline more carefully. Mrs. Pemberton prepared the tea at 6:30 and delivered it immediately. By 7 a.m., Mrs. Ashworth was dead. That's a window of just 30 minutes for a killer to act. Eleanor consulted her notes. But detective, if the room was locked from the inside, how could anyone have tampered with the tea after delivery? An astute observation, Miss Hayes, which brings us to a crucial question. Was the poison administered before or after the tea reached Mrs. Ashworth's study? Mrs. Blackthorne leaned forward, her aristocratic composure beginning to crack. You're suggesting the tea was poisoned during preparation? But that would mean ... That would mean our killer had access to the kitchen, knowledge of the morning routine, and the ability to add poison to the tea service without detection. Blackwood's gaze swept the room. Several of you were awake early this morning. Several of you had reasons to want Mrs. Ashworth silenced permanently. James Ashworth stood up, his face pale but determined. Detective, I must protest this line of questioning. My aunt was a complicated woman, but she didn't deserve to die. If someone killed her over business disputes or art authentication issues, that person is a cold-blooded murderer. Quite right, Mr. Ashworth, and that murderer is in this room. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Several guests shifted nervously, while others maintained studied composure. But Blackwood noticed the small details that betrayed guilt. The trembling hands, the averted eyes, the barely perceptible changes in breathing patterns. Now, let's examine each of your alibis more closely, he continued. Professor Hartley, you claim to have been in your room until 8 a.m. reading journals. Can anyone verify this? I'm afraid not. I prefer solitude for my scholarly work. Dr. Morrison, you stated that you were walking in the garden early this morning, despite the approaching storm. Rather unusual behavior, wouldn't you say? The museum curator's voice was barely above a whisper. I needed fresh air. The tension in the house was suffocating. Mr. Sterling, you claim to have been making telephone calls to New York, but the phone lines went down at 6:45 a.m. due to the storm. How do you explain this discrepancy? Sterling's face flushed. I must have been mistaken about the time, Mrs. Blackthorne. You mentioned being unable to sleep and spending time in the library. Yet the library is on the opposite side of the manor from your room. What drew you there so early? The elderly woman's composure finally cracked entirely. I couldn't stop thinking about my last conversation with Victoria. We had words yesterday evening about certain pieces in both our collections. Eleanor looked up sharply from her notes. What sort of words? Mrs. Blackthorne dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Victoria accused me of knowingly purchasing stolen artwork. She said she had documentation proving that several pieces in my collection were illegally obtained from European museums. During the war, this revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled group. Art theft during wartime was not merely fraud, it was a crime against cultural heritage, carrying severe legal and social consequences. And how did you respond to these accusations? Blackwood asked gently. I told her the truth, that I had purchased those pieces in good faith from reputable dealers. But Victoria said she was going to expose the entire network, regardless of who got hurt in the process. James Ashworth looked stunned. Aunt Victoria never mentioned any of this to me, perhaps because you were also implicated. Mr. Ashworth, Blackwood suggested. As her business manager, you would have been involved in many of these acquisitions. That's impossible. I handled only the legitimate transactions. If there were forgeries or stolen pieces, I had no knowledge of them, yet you stood to inherit a substantial collection worth millions. If that collection were revealed to be largely worthless or illegally obtained, your inheritance would evaporate. The nephew's face went white. You can't seriously believe I would kill my own aunt for money. People have killed for less. Mr. Ashworth, and you had intimate knowledge of her routines, access to the kitchen, an advance warning of her intentions. Inspector Carter stepped forward, his hand moving to his handcuffs. Should I make the arrest, Detective? But Blackwood held up a restraining hand. Not yet, Inspector. While Mr. Ashworth certainly had motive and opportunity, we still haven't solved the fundamental mystery. How was this crime committed in a locked room? Eleanor had been studying her notes intently throughout this exchange. Detective, what if we're approaching this backwards? Instead of asking how the killer got in and out of the study, what if we ask how Mrs. Ashworth got the poison? Continue with that thought, Miss Hayes. Well, we know the tea was prepared in the kitchen and delivered directly to the study. We know the room was then locked from the inside. But what if the poison wasn't in the tea at all? A murmur rippled through the assembled suspects. Several leaned forward with interest, while others seemed to shrink back in their chairs. You're suggesting an alternative method of administration? Blackwood asked, his eyes brightening with intellectual curiosity. Asterisk, exactly. What if the killer used a delayed action poison? Something that wouldn't take effect immediately, giving them time to establish an alibi? Dr. Morrison spoke up, her voice trembling. There are certain botanical toxins that work on a delayed basis. Some mushroom poisons, for instance, or processed plant alkaloids. And where might one obtain such exotic poisons, Doctor? Various sources. Medical research facilities, botanical gardens, specialized chemical suppliers, or ... double quote, she hesitated. Someone with access to museum preservation chemicals. The implication was clear. Dr. Morrison, as a museum curator, would have access to a wide variety of chemical compounds used in artifact preservation, some of which could be highly toxic, but that still doesn't solve the locked room mystery. Professor Hartley protested. Even with a delayed action poison, someone would have had to administer it to Victoria. The study was sealed from the inside. Blackwood smiled, the expression of a master craftsman about to reveal his greatest trick. Unless the poison was administered before Mrs. Ashworth entered the study that morning, the room fell completely silent except for the storm's continuous roar outside. Lightning flashed again, illuminating 20 faces frozen in shock and realization. You see, Blackwood continued, we've been assuming that the murder took place in the study. But what if Mrs. Ashworth was already poisoned when she locked herself in? What if the killer counted on the delayed action to provide the perfect alibi? Eleanor's eyes widened as she grasped the implications. But when could the poison have been administered? And by whom? Those, Miss Hayes, are the questions that will identify our murderer. And I believe I know exactly when, where, and how this crime was committed. The detective moved to the center of the room, his commanding presence drawing every eye. Outside, the storm began to show signs of weakening, but inside Raven's Hollow Manor, the tempest of revelation was just beginning. The killer is among us, Blackwood declared, and before this night is over, justice will be served. Asterisk. The grandfather clock struck 3 as Marcus Blackwood prepared to demonstrate his mastery of deductive reasoning. The storm outside had begun its slow retreat, but the atmosphere inside the drawing room remained electric with tension. 20 suspects sat in rapt attention, each wondering if they would be exposed as a murderer, or if someone among their number would be revealed as a killer. Eleanor had organized her notes into a comprehensive timeline, cross-referencing statements, motives, and opportunities with surgical precision. Inspector Carter positioned himself strategically near the room's exits, his experienced eye watching for any signs of panic or attempted escape. The pieces of the puzzle were all present now. Blackwood would arrange them into a picture of murder. "Ladies and gentlemen," the detective began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we have before us one of the most ingenious murder schemes I have ever encountered." The killer demonstrated not only intimate knowledge of poison and human psychology, but also a masterful understanding of misdirection. He moved to stand before the massive fireplace, its flames casting dancing shadows across his refined features. The brilliance of this crime lay not in its complexity, but in its elegant simplicity. While we focused on the impossibility of the locked room, the murderer had already struck hours earlier. Dr. Helena Morrison shifted nervously in her chair, her hands trembling as she adjusted her reading glasses. Hours earlier? But Victoria was alive when Mrs. Pemberton brought the tea. Indeed she was, Doctor. Alive, but already doomed. You see, the poison that killed Mrs. Ashworth was administered not in her morning tea, but at dinner the previous evening. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Several guests looked at each other with new suspicion, while others appeared genuinely shocked by this revelation. "But that's impossible," Professor Hartley protested. "Victoria seemed perfectly normal yesterday evening. She was angry about the authentication disputes, certainly, but she showed no signs of illness." "Precisely the point, Professor. Our killer chose a poison with a delayed action, one that would remain dormant for approximately 12 to 14 hours before taking effect. This provided the perfect alibi, as the victim would appear healthy and normal for hours after ingesting the fatal dose." Eleanor consulted her notes. "Detective, what sort of poison has such specific timing characteristics?" "Several botanical compounds possess this quality, Miss Hayes. Ricin from castor beans, for instance. But in this case, I believe our killer used something far more exotic, Sherbera odolum, known as the suicide tree. Its seeds contain cardiac glycosides that can cause delayed heart failure, mimicking natural death." Richard Sterling leaned forward, his face pale. "Where would someone obtain such an obscure poison?" "An excellent question, Mr. Sterling. The answer lies in understanding our killer's profession and access. Sherbera odolum seeds are sometimes used in museum preservation work, specifically in preventing insect damage to organic artifacts." All eyes turned to Dr. Morrison, whose face had gone completely white. She gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles showed bone white against her skin. That's merely circumstantial," she stammered. "Many people have access to unusual chemicals." "True enough, Doctor. But not many people had the opportunity to poison Mrs. Ashworth's dinner without detection. Shall I tell you how it was done?" The room held its collective breath as Blackwood began his methodical reconstruction of the crime. Yesterday evening, Mrs. Ashworth hosted a dinner party for her auction guests. The meal was served buffet style, allowing people to move freely about the dining room. During the cocktail hour, our killer approached Mrs. Ashworth's place setting and added a few drops of liquid poison to her wine glass. But surely someone would have noticed, Mrs. Blackthorne protested. Not if the person doing it appeared to be performing a perfectly innocent action. Dr. Morrison, you were observed by several guests adding something to various wine glasses during the cocktail hour. What was your explanation for this behavior? Dr. Morrison's voice was barely audible. I was adding a preservative compound to prevent the wine from staining if it spilled on valuable textiles. The dining room contained several priceless tapestries. How thoughtful of you. And how convenient that this preservative was actually a deadly poison, carefully measured to take effect just as Mrs. Ashworth would be alone in her locked study the next morning. Eleanor looked up from her notes with growing excitement. But detective, that still doesn't explain the disturbed study or the scattered authentication documents. Ah, Miss Hayes, now we come to the true genius of this crime. The killer needed to ensure that Mrs. Ashworth would be alone and isolated when the poison took effect. More importantly, they needed to create a plausible motive for murder that would point suspicion away from themselves. Blackwood began pacing again, his analytical mind laying out the crime with scientific precision. Dr. Morrison knew that Victoria Ashworth had been investigating authentication issues in her collection. What Mrs. Ashworth didn't know was that these investigations were being guided by someone with intimate knowledge of art fraud, someone who had been systematically feeding her false information. False information? James Ashworth looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, Mr. Ashworth, that the documents your aunt discovered were planted. The evidence of systematic fraud, the forged provenance papers, even the suggestions of stolen wartime art, all of it was carefully crafted to make Mrs. Ashworth believe she had uncovered a massive conspiracy. The implications of this revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled group. If the evidence was fabricated, then the motives they had all been discussing were based on lies. But why would someone go to such elaborate lengths? Professor Hartley asked, to create the perfect murder. Professor, Dr. Morrison knew that if Mrs. Ashworth appeared to die from natural causes, heart failure brought on by stress, there would be minimal investigation. But if she appeared to be murdered because of authentication disputes, the police would focus on the obvious suspects, art dealers, collectors, and authentication experts. Dr. Morrison stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. This is madness. You have no proof of any of this. On the contrary, Doctor, I have considerable proof. Shall I present it? Inspector Carter moved closer to Dr. Morrison, his hand ready to restrain her if necessary. Blackwood retrieved a manila folder from the side table where Eleanor had been organizing evidence. First, we have the analysis of the authentication documents found in Mrs. Ashworth's study. The paper is modern, aged artificially with tea stains and chemical treatments. The ink shows no signs of genuine aging. These documents were created within the last few months. That proves nothing, Dr. Morrison said desperately. Anyone could have created false documents. True, but not everyone had access to Mrs. Ashworth's personal letterhead, her private collection records, and most damning of all, her personal seal. Blackwood held up a small brass stamp. This was found hidden in your room, Doctor. It was used to authenticate the forged documents, giving them the appearance of legitimacy, Eleanor added. We also found traces of Sherbera odolum extract in your personal effects, along with detailed notes on cardiac glycoside poisoning and its effects. Dr. Morrison sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her, but her eyes still held defiance. Even if all of that were true, you still haven't explained my motive. Why would I want Victoria dead? Because Mrs. Ashworth discovered your real secret? Not art fraud or authentication disputes, but embezzlement. You had been systematically stealing from your museum for years, selling off valuable pieces and replacing them with high-quality forgeries. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Dr. Morrison had seemed like the least likely suspect, a respected museum curator with an impeccable reputation. But now the truth was emerging. Mrs. Ashworth became suspicious when she noticed similarities between certain pieces in museum collections and items being offered for private sale. She began her own investigation, completely separate from the false leads you had been feeding her. Blackwood opened another file. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Ashworth contacted the FBI's art crime team. She had compiled evidence of systematic theft from at least 6 major museums on the East Coast. The investigation was set to begin next Monday. Dr. Morrison's face crumpled with defeat. She was going to destroy everything I had worked for, everything you had stolen. You mean, those pieces were rotting in storage? No one ever saw them, appreciated them. I gave them life, brought them to collectors who truly valued their beauty, and pocketed millions in the process. Inspector Carter added grimly. Eleanor looked up from her notes. But doctor, surely you could have simply disappeared, left the country? Why commit murder? Because Victoria wouldn't let it go. She was obsessed with exposing what she called crimes against art. She said she would hunt me down no matter where I went. Dr. Morrison's voice turned bitter. She was self-righteous and vindictive, convinced she was some kind of cultural crusader. So you decided to eliminate her, Blackwood concluded. But you needed a way to do it that wouldn't point back to you. The authentication scandal was perfect. Misdirection, it gave everyone else motives for murder, while keeping you in the background as an apparent victim of Mrs. Ashworth's investigations. The room was dead silent except for the wind outside and the crackling of the fire. 20 people sat transfixed by the methodical dismantling of what had seemed like the perfect crime. The disturbed study was staged after Mrs. Ashworth collapsed from the poison. Blackwood continued. You had a key stolen from the housekeeper's ring months earlier during a previous visit to the manor. You entered the study after the poison took effect, scattered papers to suggest a desperate search, then locked the door from the inside and escaped through a method we haven't discussed yet. Dr. Morrison laughed bitterly. You're a very clever detective, but you still haven't solved your precious locked room mystery. Even if everything else you've said is true, how did I escape from a room with no other exit? Blackwood smiled, the expression of a chess master announcing checkmate. Through a method so simple, so obvious that everyone overlooked it. But before I reveal that final secret, let me ask you one question, Doctor. When you realized that Mrs. Ashworth's investigation was going to expose your theft ring, why didn't you simply confess and face the legal consequences? Because I couldn't bear to see those beautiful pieces locked away again, hidden from the world in museum storage rooms where they would never be appreciated. And that, Dr. Morrison, is where you made your fatal error. Your love of art became your obsession, and your obsession became the motive for murder. Inspector Carter stepped forward with his handcuffs. Dr. Helena Morrison, you are under arrest for the murder of Victoria Ashworth. But Dr. Morrison held up a trembling hand. Wait, you said you knew how I escaped from the locked study. I want to hear your explanation before this ends. Blackwood nodded gravely. Very well, Doctor. The truth is both simple and ingenious. You didn't escape from the locked room at all because you were never inside it. The assembled group leaned forward, desperate to hear the solution to the puzzle that had confounded them all. You see, everyone assumed that Mrs. Ashworth was alone when she died. But she wasn't. There was someone else in the study with her, someone whose presence was so natural, so expected that no one thought to question it. Eleanor's eyes widened with sudden understanding. The cat. Precisely, Miss Hayes, Mrs. Ashworth's beloved Persian cat. Duchess was known to spend every morning in the study. She was there when Mrs. Ashworth collapsed, and she was still there when the body was discovered. But how does that explain the locked room? Professor Hartley asked, still confused, because Professor Dr. Morrison used the cat as an unwitting accomplice. Before Mrs. Ashworth locked herself in the study, Dr. Morrison attached a small vial of additional poison to the cat's collar. Insurance, in case the dinner poisoning didn't work as planned. Double quotes Dr. Morrison's face showed grudging admiration for Blackwood's deductive abilities. "You really are quite remarkable, detective." The cat, following its normal routine, jumped onto Mrs. Ashworth's desk while she worked. The vial, designed to break upon impact, released a concentrated dose of contact poison. Even if the dinner poisoning had failed, this backup plan would have succeeded, but that still doesn't explain how Dr. Morrison staged the scene. James Ashworth protested because she didn't need to enter the locked room at all. The scene was staged beforehand during her late-night visit to the manor. She scattered papers, disturbed the paintings, and planted evidence while Mrs. Ashworth slept. When the poison took effect the next morning, the scene was already set. The brilliance of the plan was now fully revealed. Dr. Morrison had created a locked room mystery without ever needing to escape from a locked room. The staging was done hours before the murder, the alibi was perfect, and the misdirection had worked flawlessly until Marcus Blackwood applied his methodical intelligence to unravel the deception. Dr. Helena Morrison sat in stunned silence as the full weight of her exposure settled upon her. The other guests stared at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. The respected museum curator revealed as a cold-blooded killer. Outside, the storm's fury had diminished to a gentle snowfall. As if nature itself had calmed now that the truth was finally known, Inspector Carter approached with his handcuffs, but Blackwood held up a restraining hand. "Before we conclude this matter, I believe Dr. Morrison deserves the opportunity to tell her side of the story. After all, even the most carefully planned crimes have human emotions at their core." Dr. Morrison looked up, her eyes hollow with defeat, but still holding traces of the intelligence that had made her such a formidable adversary. "You want to know why I did it? Why I threw away everything I had worked for? I think everyone here would benefit from understanding," Blackwood replied gently. "Murder is rarely a simple matter of greed or ambition." She took a shuddering breath, composing herself with visible effort. "It started innocently enough. 20 years ago, I was a young curator at the Metropolitan Museum. I discovered that several pieces in our collection were fakes, excellent fakes, but fakes nonetheless. When I reported this to the administration, do you know what they did? The room remained silent, waiting, nothing. They buried the report, transferred me to a smaller museum, and made it clear that my career would suffer if I pursued the matter. They cared more about their reputation than the truth." Eleanor looked up from her notes with sympathy. "That must have been devastating." "It was. But it also opened my eyes to how the art world really operates. Authenticity is often less important than provenance, reputation, and money. So I decided to play by their rules, by stealing from museums and replacing originals with forgeries." James Ashworth asked, his voice heavy with disgust. "By liberating art from institutions that kept it hidden in storage, unseen and unappreciated. Do you know how many masterpieces sit in museum basements, never displayed, never enjoyed? I brought them into the light." Professor Hartley adjusted his glasses nervously. "But the forgeries you used as replacements, how did you ensure they would pass inspection?" A bitter smile crossed Dr. Morrison's face. "I didn't just steal art, Professor. I created an entire network of forgers, dealers, and corrupt officials. Some of the world's most respected authentication experts were on my payroll, including experts who might challenge pieces in Victoria's collection." Blackwood inquired, Victoria was becoming too curious, asking too many questions. I thought if I could discredit her collection through authentication challenges, she would become more cautious about investigating other collectors' acquisitions. Richard Sterling leaned forward. So all those questions about provenance and authenticity, double quotes, were designed to keep Victoria busy with her own problems while I continued my operations elsewhere. But she was more tenacious than I anticipated. Mrs. Blackthorne dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. All those accusations you made about my collection, the wartime thefts, the stolen pieces, completely fabricated. I needed to create multiple suspects with compelling motives. If Victoria died under mysterious circumstances, the investigation would focus on art authentication disputes rather than museum theft. Eleanor consulted her timeline notes. But why poison? Why not make it look like an accident? Because Victoria had already contacted the FBI. If she died in an obvious accident so close to exposing my network, it would have raised suspicions. The poison was meant to mimic natural heart failure, death by stress and overexertion. The locked room mystery was insurance, designed to confuse investigators and delay any meaningful investigation. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. The cardiac glycosides from Cerbera odolum would indeed appear to be heart failure in a cursory examination. Only a detailed toxicology screening would reveal the truth, which wouldn't have been performed if the death appeared natural, Dr. Morrison confirmed. Rural coroners rarely order extensive testing for elderly victims with no obvious signs of foul play. Inspector Carter had been listening intently throughout this confession. Dr. Morrison, can you provide the names of your co-conspirators? The forgers, dealers, and corrupt officials you mentioned? She laughed bitterly. And compound my crimes with betrayal? I may be a thief and a murderer, Inspector, but I'm not an informant. Your loyalty is admirable but misplaced, Blackwood observed. These people will continue their criminal activities, victimizing museums and collectors indefinitely. Perhaps. But that's no longer my concern. She turned to face Victoria Ashworth's nephew. Mr. Ashworth, I want you to know that your aunt was a remarkable woman. Stubborn, self-righteous, and utterly relentless, but genuinely devoted to protecting cultural heritage. In another life, we might have been allies rather than adversaries. James Ashworth's expression softened slightly. She would have appreciated that sentiment, even from someone who killed her. Dr. Morrison stood slowly, extending her hands toward Inspector Carter. I'm ready now. As the handcuffs clicked into place, she looked back at Blackwood with professional curiosity. Detective, I'm genuinely impressed by your deductive abilities. But I'm curious about one thing. How did you know about the cat? Blackwood smiled with satisfaction. Several small details that only became significant when viewed together. First, Duchess was mentioned by multiple witnesses as being unusually agitated yesterday evening, consistent with having foreign objects attached to her collar. Second, the positioning of papers on Mrs. Ashworth's desk suggested something had walked across them while the ink was still wet. Finally, Duchess was found hiding under the furniture. When the body was discovered, unusual behavior for a cat that typically enjoyed her morning routine in the study, and the contact poison on the cat's collar. A simple deduction once I understood the timeline. You needed a backup plan in case the dinner poisoning failed or worked too slowly. The cat provided the perfect delivery method, natural, unnoticed, and absolutely reliable. Dr. Morrison shook her head in admiration. You really are quite extraordinary, Detective Blackwood. I underestimated both your intelligence and your persistence, as you underestimated Mrs. Ashworth's dedication to justice, Eleanor added pointedly. Inspector Carter began leading Dr. Morrison toward the door, but she paused to address the assembled guests one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to know that none of you were ever in real danger. My quarrel was with Victoria alone. The authentication challenges, the forged documents, the manufactured scandals, all of it was misdirection designed to protect you from investigation. How considerate of you to murder someone while protecting the rest of us, Mrs. Blackthorne said with aristocratic disdain. I'm not seeking forgiveness. Mrs. Blackthorne, only understanding. The art world is corrupt, built on lies, forgeries, and stolen treasures. I simply played the game more ruthlessly than most. As Inspector Carter escorted his prisoner from the drawing room, the remaining guests sat in contemplative silence. The storm outside had ended completely, leaving Raven's Hollow Manor surrounded by pristine snow that sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight. The nightmare was over, but its implications would resonate for years to come. Professor Hartley was the first to speak. Detective Blackwood, what happens now? Dr. Morrison mentioned an extensive network of criminals. The FBI's art crime team will undoubtedly follow up on Mrs. Ashworth's research and Dr. Morrison's admissions. This investigation is far from over. It has merely solved one murder while revealing a much larger conspiracy. Eleanor gathered her notes efficiently. Will the auction still proceed? James Ashworth considered this question carefully. I think Aunt Victoria would have wanted it to continue. She believed in bringing beautiful art to people who would appreciate it. But every piece will undergo rigorous authentication before sale, a fitting tribute to her memory. Blackwood agreed. Richard Sterling cleared his throat nervously. Detective, what about those of us who were deceived by Dr. Morrison's false accusations? Will our reputations be cleared? Mr. Sterling, I believe the truth speaks for itself. Dr. Morrison has confessed to fabricating evidence against all of you. Your professional integrity remains intact. As the guests began to disperse, preparing to leave the manor now that the roads were passable, Mrs. Blackthorne approached Blackwood with curiosity. Detective, may I ask what first made you suspect Dr. Morrison? Initially, nothing specific. But as I interviewed each of you, I noticed that she was the only person who seemed genuinely surprised by the authentication disputes. Everyone else reacted as if they had expected such challenges, but Dr. Morrison appeared to be learning about them for the first time, despite being an expert in art fraud. And that was suspicious. It suggested that she knew more about the situation than she was revealing. Either she was involved in creating the disputes, or she was involved in the crimes they were meant to conceal. Eleanor joined the conversation, adding her own observations. Dr. Morrison also had the most detailed knowledge of exotic poisons and delayed action toxins. When she mentioned cherberadolum so readily during our discussion of botanical poisons, it indicated familiarity beyond academic interest. Double quotes. Mrs. Blackthorne nodded thoughtfully. I suppose we should all be grateful for your expertise, Detective. Without your intervention, Dr. Morrison might have gotten away with the perfect murder. There is no such thing as the perfect murder, madam. Every crime leaves traces, creates inconsistencies, and ultimately reveals itself to careful observation. The challenge is knowing where to look and how to interpret what we find. As evening approached, Blackwood and Eleanor prepared to return to Boston. The case was closed, justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed over even the most sophisticated deception. They stood on the manor's front steps, breathing the crisp mountain air and watching the sun set over the snow-covered landscape. Detective, Eleanor said thoughtfully, do you think Dr. Morrison was right about the art world being corrupt? Corruption exists in every field where money and prestige intersect. Miss Hayes, but that doesn't justify theft or murder. Mrs. Ashworth understood that preserving cultural heritage sometimes requires difficult choices and personal sacrifice, and now her work will continue through the FBI investigation. Indeed, sometimes justice requires more than solving a single crime. It demands exposing the systems that enable such crimes to flourish. Their motorcar crunched on the gravel drive away from Ravens Hollow Manor. Blackwood reflected on the case that had challenged his skills and reaffirmed his faith in methodical investigation. Dr. Helena Morrison had been a formidable adversary, intelligent, resourceful, and utterly ruthless. But even the most carefully planned crimes contained the seeds of their own destruction. Locked room mystery had been solved, the killer exposed, and justice served. But more importantly, Victoria Ashworth's dedication to protecting cultural heritage would live on, inspiring others to continue the fight against those who would exploit and corrupt the art world for personal gain. In the end, truth had prevailed over deception, justice over greed, and the methodical pursuit of facts over the most elaborate schemes. It was, Blackwood mused, exactly as it should be in a world where logic and observation could still triumph over the darkest human impulses. Asterisk. The case of the Vanishing Point mystery was closed, but its lessons would endure, a testament to the power of careful investigation and the unwavering pursuit of truth, no matter how cleverly it might be concealed. Back in Boston, Eleanor carefully filed their notes and evidence while Blackwood returned to his study and his morning routine of coffee and contemplation. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that no crime, however ingenious, could withstand the relentless application of human reason and moral determination. The telephone sat silent on his desk, but Blackwood knew it would ring again soon. Somewhere, another impossible crime would be committed. Another mystery would demand solution, and Marcus Blackwood would once again apply his considerable talents to the eternal struggle between chaos and order, between those who would deceive and those who would reveal the truth. Until then, he would wait, ready to answer the call when justice needed a champion and truth needed a voice.